Ahora comenzaremos el diálogo interactivo reforzado sobre la situación de los derechos humanos de las mujeres y las niñas en Afganistán, de conformidad con la resolución 50/14. Excepcionalmente, la interpretación al Dari estará disponible durante esta reunión para que sea más accesible para quienes siguen este diálogo interactivo en Afganistán. Y saludamos desde Ginebra a todas aquellas personas en Afganistán que están siguiendo este diálogo. Y les agradecemos por su interés en el trabajo del Consejo. La interpretación está disponible en el canal 8. Es un honor para mí dar la bienvenida a la señora Ilze Kehris, subsecretaria general de Derechos Humanos, quien pronunciará el discurso de apertura. Bienvenida, Ilze, una vez más. Tiene la palabra.
Distinguished President, Excellencies, colleagues and friends, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this enhanced interactive dialogue on the situation of human rights of women and girls in Afghanistan. A special welcome goes to the Afghan women and girls participating in today's dialogue and to those joining us online from Afghanistan and around the world. To have your voices at the center of our discussion is critical. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has sought to bring a diversity of voices of Afghan women inside and outside Afghanistan to this Council to ensure that you hear their own views and concerns about the issues affecting their lives. This dialogue will focus on the impact of Taliban policies on the enjoyment by women and girls of fundamental freedoms and rights. It aims to shed light on the challenges faced by certain groups of women, including minority women, and the crucial roles played by women journalists and human rights defenders. We will also highlight the limited access to justice and redress for women and girls. Since the Taliban took power in August 2021, they have repeatedly asserted that women's rights are protected within the framework of Sharia. Still, the written and verbal edicts and decrees issued by the Taliban have deprived women and girls of their human rights, removed women from most spheres of public life, and undone women's agency. Girls' secondary schools remain closed with no clear indication of when or if girls will be allowed to continue their education. Since the Taliban's rise to power, an estimated 850,000 girls have effectively dropped out of school, placing many at risk of child marriage and sexual and economic exploitation. Afghanistan is now the only country in the world where girls are denied secondary education. Considering the vital role of education in the life of children and for society as a whole, the Taliban have not only eliminated girls' development opportunities and their ability to live independent lives in the future, but have also set back the opportunity to ensure that Afghanistan is on the path to an equal, just, peaceful, and prosperous country. Restrictions on women's freedom of movement also have a detrimental effect on the lives of women and girls. For example, a ban on travel without a close male family member, a mahram, severely hinders women from accessing health care, particularly sexual and reproductive health care, livelihood, and humanitarian aid, and their ability to seek protection and justice or escape from abusive relationships. Women without male family members have been disproportionately affected. Female civil servants have been directed to stay home, and some of them even asked to nominate a male family member to replace them. Women belonging to ethnic, religious, or linguistic minority groups, including Hazaras, Tajik, Hindu, and other communities, have been subjected to particular intimidation, harassment, and discrimination owing to historical prejudice and negative stereotyping. Other groups of women, including women with disabilities, women without male family members, and young women, are also suffering from intersectional discrimination. Moreover, the Taliban has dissolved human rights oversight mechanisms, such as the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, and dismantled the specialized courts for gender-based violence and victim support services. Female lawyers' licenses have been revoked. While gender-based violence and discrimination against women has been chronic, women have nowhere to go to seek justice and redress in today's Afghanistan. They also face considerable challenges to legal representation and defense before the courts. Furthermore, with a rapid closing of public spaces for women to express their opinions freely and without fear of reprisals, the role of women journalists and women human rights defenders have become even more crucial. They have courageously continued to carry out their work both inside and outside the country, speaking up and reporting on the institutionalized and widespread oppression of women and girls by the Taliban. We are appalled by reports of attacks against women journalists and human rights defenders to silence their voices, including arbitrary arrest and detention, torture, ill treatment, enforced disappearance, and killings. We are not aware of any investigations being initiated on such cases, and no one responsible for such crimes have been brought to justice. I hope that today's dialogue will translate into concrete action and demonstrate to the very courageous women activists present today that the international community truly stands with them. We cannot stand by in the face of this misuse of religion, instrumentalized by the Taliban to systematically oppress and discriminate against women and girls. Today is an opportunity for this Council to reaffirm and act upon its unwavering commitment to the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights by all women and girls in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por su discurso de apertura. Permítame también dar la bienvenida a nuestros distinguidos presentadores, el señor Richard Bennett, relator especial sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en Afganistán, la señora Bandana, Rana, miembro del comité de la CEDAW y coordinadora del grupo de trabajo de la CEDAW sobre Afganistán, Su Excelencia el señor Nasir Andisha, representante permanente de Afganistán ante la Oficina de las Naciones Unidas en Ginebra, la señora Mahbouba Seraj, activista por los derechos de las mujeres afganas y periodista, la señora Razia, abogada afgana, excomisionada de la Comisión Independiente de Derechos Humanos de Afganistán, y la señora Zahra, Joya, periodista y representante de Rukhshana Media. La lista de oradores se cerrará en 15 minutos. Ahora tengo el honor de dar la palabra a la subsecretaria general de Derechos Humanos. Ahora veremos un video de testimonios de mujeres y niñas afganas, incluidas aquellas con discapacidades o de grupos minoritarios étnicos y religiosos, y hombres que viven en Afganistán sobre los desafíos cotidianos de derechos humanos que enfrentan las mujeres y las niñas en varios aspectos de sus vidas. Permítame recordar que existe una práctica de larga data en este Consejo con respecto al uso de material visual en los debates plenarios, según la cual la exhibición de cualquier material visual o imagen debe remitirse de antemano a la mesa para su consideración y aprobación. De acuerdo con esta práctica, el video que se mostrará ahora fue previamente presentado, revisado y aprobado por la mesa. Proyectamos el video, por favor.
Can we now start the video, please? من بلکه هزاران زن افغان از تک تک حقوق انسانی خود محروم شدند و فعلا فعالیت‌های ما خیلی کم شدند که بیشتر ما در پی حفظ جان خود هستیم.
حتی وقتی تصور میکنم اون روزها را، روزهای بعد از آگوست با روزهای قبل از آگوست مقایسه میکنم، چقدر تفاوت زیاد بوده در زندگی ما خانم‌های افغان. قبل از آگوست وقتی از خانه بیرون میشدم اصلا هراس نداشتم، اصلا ترسی نداشتم به اینکه کسی در مورد چادر ما صحبت میکنه، کسی در مورد حجاب ما صحبت میکنه که حجاب ما چرا رنگ سفید است، چرا سرخ، چرا زرد، یا در مورد از اینکه کسی استادم بکنه بگه میشه موبایل ما چک بکنم که در موبایل تو چی داری، تو کی هستی، تو کجا هستی. اصلا هراس نداشتم.
زنان افغانستان تماما حقشان پایمال شده، حتی نمیتوانند به مکاتب خود برند. حتی اونایی که 20 سال یا 30 سال است کار کردن از حق و حقوقشان محروم شدن.
ما تو باسم خواري وکړم ترڅو وکولای سم هغه لوړ هدف سیدی هغه وټاکم. د خپل ځان لپاره مې ډیر لوړ هدفونه ټاکل لاسه کم چې نور لري او زین لرم. بدبختانه د هر څه له منځه ولاړل.
اولادایم که دخترایم همشان در خانه ماندن، دروازه مکتب بر روی همگی بسته شده و هر آن آرزویی که برشان داشتم همیشه از بین رفته و وقتی به طرف چهره مایوس اولادایم میبینیم باعث از این میشه که زندگی برام بسیار سخت و هیچ احساس خوب ندارم.
آنقدر اینا خودشون روی افراد و اشخاص دانسته و فهمیده ما تاثیر گذاشتن که حتی اینا حال به پرخاشگری روی آوردن. حتی افراد خانه ما اینا یک رویه عادی و نرمال ندارن.
و اینکه 1 سال مگذره از طالبا، ولی تا الحالم اونا نتونستین که کوچکترین یک مجرای امید برای اتباع افغانستان و خاصتا که زنان و دختران افغانستان. متاسفانه من تا جایی که میبینم طالبان فقط گروه مورد هدفشان خانما و دختر خانما هستن. هر روز یک اعلامیه جدید، هر روز یک راهکار جدیدی که بتونه ممانعت و موانع صدرای خانم خلق کنه را بیشتر می سازند.
در این مدت شما هم قسمی که خودتون شاهد هستید و ما هم از طرف دولت امارات خیلی توجه صورت گرفته و میگیره تا اینکه بتونه سکوت خانم ها را بیشتر و بیشتر بسازه و نسبت به اوایل 15 آگوست تا به حال تا این مدت هم زیاد به این موفق شدن.
مردها بتونیم کار بکنیم و مثل مردها بتونیم راه بریم در شهر، بازار، پارک، عروسی. ما حق داریم، حق زندگی را داریم و حق کار را داریم، حق تحصیل را داریم.
و خواستم از جامعه بین المللی است که در مورد اینمی حمایت از حقوق زنان بیشتر تلاش بکنن، مخصوصا زمینه کاری که زنان بیشترشان اکثریتشان نانآور خانه هستند ولی فعلا کار ندارن و در شرایط خیلی بد زندگی میکنن.
و همچنین از جامعه جهانی توقع ای را داریم که صدای زن افغانستان را بشنوند. امروز خیلی خیلی نیاز دارن زن افغانستان که تا صدایشان شنیده شود و همنوایی شوند.
در صورتی ما میتوانیم زنان افغانستان را حمایت کنیم که در تمام عرصه‌های سیاسی، اجتماعی، فرهنگی و اقتصادی
ما به عنوان یک فعال و همچنان به عنوان یک فرد، یک خانم فعال در افغانستان براتون از جامعه جهانی خواهانم است. اولین چیزی که وجود داره مسئولیت مالی و جانب خانم هایی که تاکنون در افغانستان مانده و میخواین که بیشتر فعالیتشان را دست ندن و دوباره فعالیتشان آغاز کنن و پیشرفت داشته باشن.
ما آینده درخشان داشته باشیم، آینده ما تضمین شود که برای ما خانم ها اجازه داده شود که ما حق از اینکه حق تحصیل داریم، از لحاظ شرعی و قانونی و حقوقی که باید ما درس خود بخوانیم، مکتب بریم، وظیفه بریم، کمک بکنیم یا حمایت شویم، باید آینده ما تضمین باشه.
Muchas gracias. Doy la palabra ahora al señor Richard Bennett para su presentación, por favor.
For his presentation, please.
Mr. President, Excellencies, Afghan women in the room and women and girls online. Salam alaikum. It's my honor to share this space with you today, and quite difficult to follow that video. I thank the Council for creating this opportunity to have a dialogue with Afghan women following the urgent debate at its 51st session. This dialogue is much needed because it is important to create multiple platforms for Afghan women to make their voices heard. As I've said repeatedly, my role is not to speak for Afghan women, but to support opportunities for them to speak to policymakers and, where possible, to amplify their concerns and their calls for action. So I very much welcome this opportunity to speak alongside and in support not only of the women on this podium with me, but also all the Afghan women and men speaking and otherwise participating today. On the 1st of July, I had the privilege of speaking at the urgent debate on behalf of the Coordinating Committee of the UN Special Procedures, and I noted that the current rollback of the rights of women in Afghanistan reflects previous experience during the 1996 to 2001 period, and in parts of the country controlled by the Taliban before August 2021. We cannot allow history to repeat itself. Mr. President, the denial of women's and girls' rights is central to the Taliban's ideology, which includes women's exclusion from public and political life. If the Taliban were in charge of this council, would there be a single woman in this room, let alone speaking? While the human rights of women and girls have never been respected in Afghanistan fully, nowhere else globally has there been as widespread and all-encompassing a rollback as since the Taliban seized power last year. Step by step, with one exception, edicts have been imposed that not only restrict women and girls' daily lives, they rob them of their futures and strip them of their identity and dignity, including, for example, the suspension of girls' secondary education, mandatory face covering, the injunction to stay at home except when necessary, requirement for a mahram, and the punishment of men for the so-called misdemeanors of their female relatives. Women and girls belonging to ethnic and religious minority groups and those with disabilities face further discrimination and complications, as do single mothers, older women, and women who are sole income earners. Let me be clear. Afghanistan must comply with its international obligations on the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the Convention on the Political Rights of Women. Such compliance is not optional. The de facto authorities must change their policies and uphold women's human rights. If they don't change, they must be held to account. In this regard, all forms of gender justice, including considerations of gender persecution, may be warranted, as is the further exploration of the concept of gender apartheid. I could continue to list the ways in which the human rights of Afghan women and girls have been curtailed. Instead, I'd like to celebrate the strength and resilience of Afghan women and girls who continue to lead the non-violent campaign for human rights and an inclusive, stable society. As we are hearing today, Afghan women are articulate, determined, organized, courageous. The international community should listen to their demands, work with them, support them, help them to transform aspirations into concrete plans and support those plans politically and with resources, all while ensuring the safety and protection of the women and girls concerned. In conclusion, to all the Afghan women and men in the room and online, I'm committed to continue to fight for the fundamental freedoms of all Afghans, including women and girls. I offer you my solidarity, and I thank you for your trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Y le doy la palabra ahora a Su Excelencia, el señor Nasir Andisha. Embajador, tiene la palabra.
Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Madam Assistant Secretary General, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. we once again
ما یک
reiterate our
بار دیگر
appreciation
تکرار
to the
میکنیم
European
تحسین
Union
میکنیم از اتحادیه اروپا
and all other states
و
for
تمام
supporting the request
کشورهای
for an
دیگه
urgent
که
debate,
تقاضای
which
ما
paved the
را
way
قبول
for
کردند
today's
که
enhanced interactive
دانسته
dialogue.
باشیم یک بحث و
We also thank the
دیالوگ
Office of the High
چندجانبه
Commissioner for
داشته
Human
باشیم.
Rights and the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation for Afghanistan for their continued support. Mr. President, I want to quote a little Afghan girl from Herat province, quoting, "It's better to die once than to die 1,000 times. If you, the Taliban, want to put us in cages for 1,000 years, we will resist you for 1,001 years." These are words that no girls in the world should ever have to say. But these are the words of Samia, a young schoolgirl from Herat in western Afghanistan. The words depict the harrowing environment under which millions of women and girls in Afghanistan are living currently. The speed with which the Taliban have subjugated the population is deeply alarming. Their policies added up to a widespread, systematic, and all-encompassing attack and atrocities. The suffocating crackdown intensifies with each new day. The Taliban have broken every promises to the international community, to the people of Afghanistan, and to the women and girls of Afghanistan. Their subjective and extremist ideological interpretation of Islam is antithetical to the international human rights law. Their draconian, misogynistic form of rule does not reflect our religion, our culture, and our values. Anyone trying to suggest that what Taliban are doing part of Afghanistan culture is adding insult to the injury. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the Taliban are going on the opposite side of modernity and human progress. As a group, they can choose to do so. But as a nation, we are not going to allow them to take our country, 38 million men and women, back with themselves. And we expect the world not to be a mere spectator. We are all human beings, born equal in dignity. And women and girls across the country in Afghanistan are entitled to every right enshrined in the treaties in which Afghanistan is a party. Mr. President, 1 year later, we have not been able to open the doors of schools for girls of all ages to ensure quality of education. Let's make no mistake that opening secondary schools is no panacea. It's just a basic right. Women are penalized for exercising the most basic right, the right of moving freely. Victims and survivors of gender-based violence have nowhere to turn, no courts, no representation, no support, no shelter, no independent human rights commission. Young girls are increasingly forced into marriage. Restrictions on the work have created a desperate situation for those who were the sole and primary wage earner of their family. Women remain unable to serve in the parliament, in judiciary, or civil service. Conflict, poverty, food insecurity, and the negative impact of climate change multiplying the challenges of daily life in Afghanistan. The suicide rate is unspeakable. Women and girls belonging to the Hazara, Shia, Sufi, and Sikh communities are at the grave risk of unmanageable atrocities. As women's rights activists and defenders peacefully protest against the total affront to their right, they continue to face intimidation, harassment, arbitrary arrest, forced confession, and enforced disappearance. In the Taliban's effort to silence them, detention centers remain inaccessible, and the full extent of cruelties are still unknown. The failure to act is and complacence in the face of visible gender apartheid. We commend the work of UNAMA, the Special Rapporteur, the NGOs. However, their capacity, staff, and resources are not enough to create foundation for accountability and prevention. we call for immediate establishment of an independent monitoring mechanism by this Council to document violation, abuse of human rights and international humanitarian law, to identify responsible and to provide victim redress and a venue to be heard. Any further delay will only prolong misery and can encourage impunity. Mr. President, we look forward to hearing from women of Afghanistan, their experiences and suggestions, which are material to a robust dialogue and decisive action by this Council. Women and girls continue to demonstrate exceptional strength, courage, and resistance. Their dream of a better future is still alive. Their meaningful participation as an essential condition for the protection of human rights, rule of law, and durable peace. The international community must not give up on them. All people of Afghanistan, all people of the world deserve to lead safe, fulfilling life free from oppression. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. Tiene ahora la palabra la señora Mahbouba Seraj para su presentación. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Mr. President. My name is Mahbouba Seraj. I am a woman and human rights activist in Afghanistan. I have been in Afghanistan for a lot of years now, especially in the past year when the Taliban arrived. I decided to stay in Kabul. And the decision that I made why I decided to stay in Kabul was because I wanted to be a witness of what was going to be happening in my country and be the one that hopefully could tell the world one day what is going on. As of August 15th of 2021, in a matter of 24 hours, I saw a democracy that the world worked on for the past 20 years disappear in front of my eyes in 24 hours. It was like it never existed before. That's how the democracy was fundamental in Afghanistan. Saying in my language that says to the world, don't kill me and don't cry for me. That's what the world is doing to us. They're killing us and then they're crying for us. What is this? I cannot tell you how sick and tired of this I am. I am seeing my country today falling into such a depths of despair as far as humanity is concerned, as far as the rights of the human beings are concerned, as far as everything that we worked so hard and the world worked so hard and spent so much money on it. What happened? What did we do? Where did we go wrong? Is anybody in the world going to actually take stock and think about this, or we are not? Today, the human rights in Afghanistan does not exist. You see, the thing is, that's the weirdest thing. Human rights in Afghanistan, especially for the women. I walk in the streets of Kabul. A Talib comes and looks at me, but that Talib does not see me. I don't exist in front of him, not me. All of us, the women of that country, we don't exist. He just looks at us and then that's it. We are erased. Do you know what that feeling is? To be erased? I'm erased. And I don't know what else to do. This is the last hope, and this is the last time I'm going to come somewhere and talk about this to the world. Because I'm sick and tired of doing it, and I'm not going to do it anymore. How many times am I supposed to yell and scream and say, world, pay attention to us, we are dying? World, what did you do to us? Why did you do this to us? And fix it, because you can fix it. Don't tell me you cannot. I can sit down with you and I can show you the ways you can fix it. Why aren't you fixing it? You're just giving me, money and food and what? That's not good enough, please. You saved us one winter, we did not die. What are you going to do this winter? What are you going to do next year? What are you going to do the year after that? Are we going to all die in Afghanistan and there's not going to be any Afghanistan anymore? Is that the name of the game here? I'm begging you, I'm begging all of you, Please, if this council has something to do, do it. Otherwise, please don't talk about it. Because talking has been like cheap, and everybody has been doing it. All over the world we are talking. We are talking, and we are talking, and we are talking. And then we are dying. How long? How long? I mean, the Sikhs of Afghanistan, they had a place to go. Maybe Canada gathered them all. Maybe they had India. What about my Hazaras? What are they supposed to do? Like empty Afghanistan and disappear? Because nobody wants them? What is this? This doesn't make any sense. So please, really get a hold of yourselves and let's do something about Afghanistan. It's not going to work this way. As far as, bringing that independent monitoring mechanism, I think it's about time to do that. Because you see what really scares me is that the social media, it's an animal that is feeding itself. So all of these reports are being fed to social media. God only knows what kind of atrocities are disappearing. God only knows what kind of atrocities are not being reported. God only knows. And I want that to be reported because this is not right. World, this is not right. Please, please, you've got to do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we listen very carefully to your appeal. And thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Le doy la palabra a la señora Razia Sayad para su presentación en video.
Ms. Razia Sayad for her presentation in video form.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to extend my gratitude to Mr. Richard Bennett for his timely report highlighting the deteriorating human rights situation of women and girls in Afghanistan. Since the Taliban's forceful return to power, the de facto regime in Kabul has committed gross human rights violations against the people of Afghanistan, particularly women and girls. The regime has banned girls from education, deprived women of their rights to work, persecuted women activists, journalists, and judges, and imposed degrading anti-women rules. A year into the Taliban rule, the women of Afghanistan have been robbed of their legal, social, and human identities. There is no sign of their meaningful participation in public life across the country. The current tragedy is a byproduct of disruption of political, legal, and social protection systems and institutions that were built and developed over the last 2 decades, thanks to the international engagement with and investment in the people of Afghanistan. Those institutions relatively guaranteed women's access to justice, they are no more in place. When it comes to justice, the women of Afghanistan are now left to the mercy of a group that is inherently anti-women and does not recognize women as human beings. Mr. President and distinguished representatives, expecting the Taliban to bend to international pressure and respect women or guarantee their access to justice is unrealistic and a waste of time. Since August 2021, the regime has dismantled several institutions whose mandates were to protect women's rights and enhance their access to justice. The Taliban have disbanded Afghanistan Independent Bar Associations, the Ministry of Women Affairs, the Human Rights Support Directorate of the Ministry of Justice, the Prosecution Office Against Harassment of Women, and the Gender Directorates of all ministries. The regime has also shut down the courts and prosecution offices for the elimination of violence against women. Female judges, prosecutors, and defense lawyers are prohibited from practicing law. The regime discredited the licenses of 7,000 defense attorneys, including 1,400 female attorneys at once. Later, they renewed the licenses of male attorneys only. As a result, hundreds of lawsuits instigated by women are stacked in the courts. Tragically, under Taliban rule, women lawyers and attorneys are replaced with fanatic uneducated Taliban members whose verdicts are neither based on civil nor Sharia laws. Unfortunately, a large number of regime's detainees are women. According to a local NGO, the regime's morality police has arbitrarily detained nearly 1,500 women over the last 4 months. Under the current circumstances, these women have no prospects for access to justice. Within the Taliban justice system, there is no difference between a suspect, an accused, and a convict. It's a personal decision of a so-called Taliban judge to determine someone's fate. Women are particularly mistreated and insulted in judicial institutions. Reports of forced marriage by the Taliban across Afghanistan are extremely alarming. There are also reports of the Taliban militias intruding into people's homes and raping women and underage girls. Please remember that Tamanna, Parwana, Bilqis, and Ilaha are not the only women who have been arrested, tortured, and forced into marriage. Thousands of other women silently suffer from the increasing abuses and brutality of the Taliban militias across Afghanistan. We must hold the regime accountable. In March 2022, the Taliban dissolved Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commissions, the only national human rights body that maintained a critical role in monitoring, investigating, documenting, and reporting human rights violations across the country. Now there is an institutional vacuum to deliver that mission. We need to have a UN representative mechanism to collect, preserve, and analyze the Taliban crimes more structured way. The future of transitional justice in Afghanistan depends on how properly and responsibly we handle this crisis today. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Le doy la palabra ahora a la señora Zahra Joya para su presentación.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is 13 months since my fellow citizens and I lost our country to one of the darkest forces of time, the Taliban. Today, I'm speaking before you here as an Afghan woman journalist. Although it has never been easy to be a woman and journalist in Afghanistan. It is now much more difficult to be a woman in Afghanistan. Being a journalist is far-reaching wish. Unfortunately, there are very few female journalists remaining in the country. It is impossible to explain the impact of thousands of women losing their jobs and futures in just 1 year. Yet, we are now fighting for our fundamental rights, the right to go to school, the right to be allowed to work, the right to wear what we like. Taliban rule has reduced the value of women's life to their bodies and sexual organs. The groups has imposed strict restrictions on women's personal and social life. Women journalists are particularly at risk. They are disappearing from Afghan media landscape because they are women and work in the media. As you all know, the media and women are at the center of the Taliban's aggressive policy. The Taliban has imposed a lot of guidelines that restrict women and many guidelines that restrict what the media can cover in Afghanistan. More than 500 media outlets have stopped operating since the Taliban took power. Hundreds of journalists lost their jobs. Hundreds of media workers, including myself, fled Afghanistan. One female reporter told me, and I quote, "I lost my country, home, and job as a journalist, and I was deprived seeing my children for a year, so I have to start my life from scratch." Ethnic minorities in Afghanistan, including the Hazara community, are also being victimized by the Taliban and ISIS. Time has proven that the return of the Taliban to power in Afghanistan began a period of instability for ethnic minorities, including Hazaras in Afghanistan. In 1980s, some 218,000 Sikh and Hindus lived in Afghanistan, but less than 10 people remain in the country today. According to the new report of the Human Rights Watch, 13 attacks against the Hazara community have been organized by IS in the past year, and the Taliban, as the new rulers of Afghanistan, have not taken any single measure to protect them. According to the reporter of members of British Parliament, Hazara in Afghanistan are facing genocide. As a journalist from the same community, I suggest to the member of the United Nations to monitor the situation of the ethnic minorities, especially the Hazara people, which is the third largest ethnic group in Afghanistan, and to investigate the crimes against the humanity and to recognize the genocide of the Hazaras in Afghanistan. According to the UN Special Reporter and several human rights watchdogs reports that we have access, ethnic minorities, including the Hazara community, have been deprived of humanitarian aids for a year, and the Taliban group behaves in a very discriminatory manner. I suggest human rights organizations hire employees from the Hazara community and work closely with them. My third suggestion is that you should maintain pressure on the Taliban through those countries that have close relations with them. And my last call, I strongly urge the member states of the United Nations to provide humanitarian visas to the people at high risk, whose lives are threatened, particularly those from vulnerable groups such as minority communities and women at risk. Afghanistan is going through a critical time, and it is history, and to the people of Afghanistan are looking to you for support. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony and thoughts. Tiene la palabra ahora la señora Bandana Rana,
Bandana Rana,
conectada por Zoom.
Who is on Zoom.
Thank you very much, Mr. President and respected dignitaries. I am truly honored to be a part of this enhanced interactive dialogue and express my strong commitment with the previous speakers, particularly the brave women of Afghanistan. Afghanistan, not surprisingly, is ranked 156th out of 156 countries by the Global Gender Gap Index 2021. In 2022, the situation is even worse, and we have heard that. Girls are banned from secondary education in most of the provinces and from almost all kinds of employment. Women in universities face harsh new restrictions. The officials on the street often enforce the policy of requiring a mahram, a male family member chaperone, to accompany any woman leaving her home. Health sector is plagued with service gaps, shortage of stock, supply and equipment, limited specialized care for women, particularly around reproductive health. There is reportedly an increase in child marriage and gap in protection, legal aid, and support services for women and girls. This has immensely exacerbated the challenges faced particularly by female heads of households, single women, widows, and women living with disabilities. Women's participation in political and civil life is almost nil. When the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Reem Al-Salem, and myself went to Kabul in April 2022 on an unofficial visit, this was exactly what we found based on our meetings and interactions with the diverse stakeholders, including de facto authorities, UN agencies, humanitarian service providers, and women's rights activists. However, there was also some silver lining in the dark cloud, with narratives from some women workers, particularly working for NGOs and humanitarian services, such as hospitals and refugee camps, where they were able to continue their work after maneuvering careful negotiations with some de facto authorities. But such cases were very few. Some of the de facto authorities we met also stated that the provision of banning girls from school was temporary, and soon a positive decree could be expected. However, the situation since then seems to have got worse, and all directives from the de facto authorities more and more have reinforced the dominance and control of men over women's lives. I do recall the conversation with young girls who had been forced to leave schools, and this situation had affected their mental health immensely. Some girls narrated how earlier the streets of Afghanistan was unsafe for girls, but in the present situation, they felt unsafe in their own homes with increased sexual violence in the domestic sphere with no place to report. Unless the international community intervenes now, the impact of the reinforcement of male dominance will compel the girls to grow up in and be shaped by an extremely patriarchal society. We also met with civil society representatives who, despite systematic regression, have been in the front line of protests and organizing for collective action and united voice. Women continue to be brave, on many instances, negotiating their mobility and safety, organizing marches in spite of being faced with threat, arrest, detention, and intimidation. Women leaders who have fled the country continue to mobilize global attention on women's rights, conducting briefings, providing data from the ground, and forming coalitions to strategize on how best to influence the authorities. The Ministry of Women Affairs and Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission have been abolished, deactivating all women's rights machineries. Reinstating the Ministry for Propagation of Virtue and Prevention of Vice sends a clear signal that there is no room for women or entities tasked to take gender equality forward. Almost all shelters for women and girls have been closed. Women's sports are banned. Women journalists have been forced to leave work amidst an environment of harassment, violence, and censorship. All this has completely relegated women to their private spheres and reinforced the norms that justify exclusion. Many Afghani women inside and outside the country are presently worried that the world is getting too comfortable with the Taliban regime. The international community needs to put women's rights in Afghanistan as a prerequisite for all engagement with the de facto authorities. In this regard, the potential work of the CEDAW Committee as an independent international human rights body addressing discrimination against women could be an entry point for establishing engagement with the de facto authorities. CEDAW Committee had asked for an exceptional report from the authorities on the situation of women, which was due the end of July. We have been following up and anticipating some form of communication from the de facto in this regard. The international community should continue to create spaces to make the voices of Afghan women and girls heard in all international fora, to build their capacity to strategize, advocate, and be able to negotiate and amplify the diversity of Afghan women's voices. Best practices from Islamic countries and Islamic scholars in support of Afghan women to counter the Taliban narrative could be mobilized. CEDAW has had many positive dialogues with Islamic states in building full compliance to the convention. The Taliban has been subjected to international sanctions, which is clearly hindering humanitarian operations in Afghanistan. It is critical for the international community to also come together and use the leverages at their disposal to take forward the human rights and humanitarian response hand in hand. Women's critical leadership is critical to inform the design of humanitarian assistance and effective delivery. Women and girls across Afghanistan deserve equality and the right to live with dignity, which should be defined by the women and the girls themselves. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a todos y todas las panelistas por sus importantes intervenciones. Vamos a comenzar la